For those of you that have rejoined us back at the main stage, we are about to jump into the panel discussion. And tonight we have Steve Alexander, Graeme Fowler, who's the Exec VP of Engineering, Nadia Alramli, who's the Director of Engineering at HubSpot, and they will be facilitated by Marta, I'm going to get this right now, Jasinska, who is the CTO at Bloom and Wild. I am sure it is quite the comic book geek, so hopefully we'll get to chat more about that later too. She will be facilitating the discussion all around the practical approaches for creating a team to plan and budget.
All right, here we are. Welcome to our panel. I'm kind of pausing because I'm trying to make sure we are live, but I think we are live. So welcome everyone to our panel. We will be talking about planning and budgeting approaches for creating great engineering teams. So if you love working with engineers and building teams and also love a good spreadsheet, this is a great place to be at, especially on Thursday evenings, just at the end of a CTO Craft conference. So thank you for being here. We have a great panel with us today. I'm really excited about actually hearing them talking about this. Nadia, Graeme, and Steve, they're going to introduce themselves just in a minute and tell us a bit more about how they're thinking about planning, building, and budgeting teams and executing against those budgets. Before we dive in, I just want to let you all know that the session is recorded. You'll be able to watch it later on. And please think about questions throughout the session. There will be many opportunities during the session to do a little Q&A. So hit us up with questions as we go through this. And I'm going to turn to our great panel and ask them to introduce themselves to you. Graeme, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, hi there. I'm Graeme Fowler. I'm a senior engineering leader with expertise in scaling product-led engineering teams globally, specializing in OTT platforms over the last 15 years, recently working at Sky, more recently at Dazn, the Netflix of sport, leading a team of around 500 there and scaling them up for the context for this, scaled up by around nearly 300 people over the last 2 years there, so hyper growth. Thank you.
That's a lot of people, yeah, thanks. Nadia, do you want to go next?
Sure. So hi, I'm Nadia Alramli. I'm currently a director of engineering in HubSpot, where I lead the teams that build world-class marketing products for businesses. Before HubSpot, I was working in the video games industry for over a decade, working on in Activision publishing on games like Call of Duty, and that I've dealt from situations where we had modest growth to no growth to even trying and reducing costs as well.
Fantastic. And you heard it here first. Nadia and I are going to create a Slack channel for people recovering from gaming industry jobs. So you can join us later.
Sounds great.
And then Steve, you join our panel, I think as the last addition to the panel. So can you introduce yourself for us as well?
Yeah, sure. So I describe myself as a technology leader. I've done consulting. I've worked in a senior role in a public company. I guess the most well-known thing that I did was I was on the founding team of Canonical that makes Ubuntu Linux. And so we were developing the internal tools and the commercial services there. I did that for a number of years. Most of my career has been about starting with a reasonably small company or group and then scaling it up reasonably quickly and seeing the changes that occur during that.
Great. Thank you all. Thanks for being here and talking us through this. And yeah, let's talk about planning and budgeting. We actually got together a couple of times before the panel and we quickly realized that this is a very broad subject and you can approach it in many, many ways. Frankly, we could talk about this for hours going into different rabbit holes. So it's trying to make sure that we're going to cover it broadly enough for it to be useful for everyone who's participating here and attending this panel. So we're going to break it down into three sections, three kind of main themes that we want to focus on. We're going to be talking about approach to actual planning and budgeting. So, how do you start? What questions do you ask yourself? Who do you collaborate with a bit? But then we're going to move into how do we involve the wider business outside of technology into that process? And who are the key people you need to talk with and how you're doing that, how you're managing that process? And then we're going to move towards, you have your plan, you have your spreadsheet, you have your number that you're managing towards. How are you executing against the budget and how you're adjusting it as the world around you changes? So I think that's a very relevant part of this panel, especially in 2020. We'll try to keep on time for each section, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions from the audience during the panel. All right, so let's start with approach to planning and budgeting. Where do we start? Now, Graeme, you have lots of experience growing the teams. You talked about, getting up to 300 people. What are your tips on how you start this process? Staring at the empty spreadsheet. How do you get started?
So I think normally when you approach this subject, there's two scenarios that come to you. Either the business has decided they want a number of resources. Let's make a number up, 500. I don't know where they come up with this number half the time. Or the business has come to you as an engineering leader and say, oh, I've got X amount of work that needs to be delivered. How many people do I need? So they're typically the two scenarios that start this discussion. I won't go into, okay, how do you work out how many resources for the project? I think that's a different topic. But the first thing you always need to start with for me is a headcount plan, just a high level business headcount plan that looks at what you're trying to achieve. So you've got your number, you know when you need to try to deliver it by, but there are so many questions and things that you need to consider while looking at this. So, I'll just throw some up in the air. I'm sure there's more, but you have to think about, is this perm resource? Is it non-perm? Is it agencies? What types of roles? What's the seniority? What's the capacity of the recruitment team? You need to talk to them. How many people can they find? How many people can you physically onboard as a team, as an organization? Do you have somewhere for them to sit? Do you need to get another building? Like what surrounds that? What about IT services? Do you pick different strategies? Do you hire managers to hire their teams? Do you just hire individuals and work out how to create them later? So there's so many things that need to go in, and you really need to sit down when you start this and look at your specific scenario, your specific business case, your business, and work out what are the key decisions you need to make. And I think a lot of people build out these plans, especially when you're dealing with hypergrowth. And one thing they do forget is plan for retention and attrition, because you may be hiring, but you may be losing them just as fast. If you haven't factored that in, you'll end up catching out later, because in our industry attrition is a problem. So yeah, I would make sure that you need to think about that. But overall, yeah, you need to come up, looking at all those, come up with an overall plan, and then start to build your financial models off of that. And once you've got financial models, then yeah, delivery plans. And so yeah, I think there is definitely lots to think about at the start. When you start going into it, like you say, it is a bit of a rabbit hole, and it can become a bit unwieldy. But you need to get something down on paper that you can start having a discussion around. And I think one thing is good to look at is around, once you've looked at all of those, where are those bottlenecks? What can you improve? Is recruitment are saying they can only hire 2 people a month? Well, okay, we need to fix that, and we need to work with the recruitment team around that. So yeah, lots to think about.
Yeah, I love that. It's so many different aspects of it. Is there any way to, do you have any tips on how do you prioritize them, or maybe even remove some of them from consideration at all?
I think you need to, first of all, you just need to get something down on paper that looks roughly right. Okay, this is something that's reasonably achievable. And then you can take that plan around, and you'll no doubt get some pushback. It's either taking too long, or it's not aggressive enough, or facilities can't get people, and then you'll need to revise it and work with those teams. I think instead of trying to get the answers from everyone, I think just get a plan together and take that around. Once you've got something that you can all look at and point towards, it then forms that conversation. Without it, you end up going round and round and round. It takes forever. You never get a plan, because you're like, okay, I'll go and talk to recruitment, I'll go and talk to facilities, I'll go and talk to finance, I'll go and talk to whoever it may be, and you can just get bogged down. So I think just try to put something down on paper to start that conversation, and make sure you're bringing people into the conversations early, and bring them along for the journey, definitely.
Yeah, and I think, Nadia, we've been talking a bit about optimizing for certain aspects of your plan, because we have so many different levels to pull and so many different things to focus on. how are you approaching kind of optimizing? What are you going to be optimizing for? And then once you have those, what do you do with that information?
I think in particular, I think Graeme already covered a lot of the things that really applicable in many, many situations. I think one thing I want to talk about in particularly in relation to optimizing is sometimes you are at a different stage in the organization life cycle. So, we talked a bit here about rapidly growing organization and the challenges that come with that you need to consider in your planning. But sometimes you're scaling down or maybe staying stable or having slight growth, and the planning process there, while similar, there's some aspects to consider, like optimizing for managing cost and trying to keep it down and trying to plan for that while still delivering on your key priorities and bringing revenue. I would recommend, so like one thing I would say that really can work really well in these situations is actually scenario building, and involving the teams in that scenario can really be helpful in setting that expectation. So I would start by asking the teams to prioritize, to identify their priorities for next year, and then build 3 scenarios. The one would be what your next year deliverables look like if you're having a 10% headcount cut, and the same thing if you're having a flat headcount, and another for if you have a 10% headcount increase. Now, this is a thought exercise. It's very useful for people to have if you're not experiencing growth, because it can really help focus on what really matters. And oftentimes when you bring that exercise to teams or people, they can come to you and say, well, my most important project cannot happen unless you give me this headcount. And in that case, I would likely push back and say, are we putting our resources where they need to go based on priority? Are we planning accordingly? We can't just pick the highest priority project and say, it can't happen unless you give me headcount. What are we doing with the existing headcount? Now, obviously, there could be situations where there's dependencies, roadblocks that quarantines that, but it's just really important to be pragmatic about these situations when you're trying to optimize for cost saving. So the point of that exercise really is to find the optimal budget to deliver the most important projects for long-term success. And based on that, you could divert your resources and budget from one area to another to try and deliver on the most optimal plan.
Yeah, I love that. You start with like really broad problem of many different things to consider, and then you involve the teams in scenario planning. And it may be a bit scary for the teams as well to consider those scenarios. I think it's really important we remember that this is an exercise that impacts people, like they're human beings that are part of those teams. Which really is like, when we're thinking about what we're optimizing for, we also have to consider things like the diversity of your team, location where the team is at, like many different things that you can think of from that human perspective, human side of the team. Steve, I know you have some thoughts on this one. Do you want to share how you approach thinking about setting up the team, diversity of your team, location of your team? How do you approach that side of the process?
Yeah, sure. I guess my guiding thought is like, it's very easy to think of a budget. Maybe you've got an annual budget for something, and to think of that as a budget for the things you have to achieve during that year. But at the end of that year, you're now in a new situation, and you've got a new starting point, and your budget's also got to take you to a good starting point, rather than one that puts you in kind of a worse situation than you might be in. It's a bit like when kids are kind of learning to play with other kids, maybe play sports or play other things. And it is, you can sometimes get these kids who are hyper, like they really want to achieve, they want to win the game, whatever, and they're playing in such a way that nobody invites them back the next time. And the goal of learning to play well is that you achieve a lot of things when you're playing and you get invited back to play again. So it's having this. So it's looking at things like you've got the data of how much you're spending, how much you're achieving, all that kind of stuff that it's probably quite straightforward to capture data about. But then you've got all this kind of, I guess I think about it a bit like technical debt, which I guess we're all familiar with, but it's like people debt. It's the debt of like how how kind are people able to be now that they've been through this year of delivering stuff? How would they recommend working here to other people, and how does that impact the morale of the place, but also your recruitment? If people aren't using word of mouth to recruit other people because they've had a terrible year, that might be a problem. Whereas if they've had an awesome year, that makes your recruitment so much easier. Are people worn out? Does everyone need like 3 months holiday by the time they've delivered this, whatever aggressive goals the year might have? Or are they ready for a new year, right? There's all these kind of different things. And there are ways to measure them, but they're all kind of soft ways. They're things like talking to people, being there where the work's being done. People have talked about skip level one-on-ones, all these other kinds of ways of getting in touch with the team. I know someone recently who did a net promoter score kind of survey all around, would you recommend being on your team to a friend of yours, something like this, and use that as some sort of touch point to see how the teams are going.
Yeah, I love that. So again, considering spreadsheets involving your team and thinking about human beings and making sure that you're considering their feedback, that's really what gets you into planning mode. Yeah, go ahead.
There's one more thing just about diversity, which is there's a metaphor of like a canary in the coal mine, which is in the old days when people went into coal mines to mine coal, there would often be poisonous gases, and they would have some poor bird that would be more sensitive to kind of dying. It's kind of an unfortunate story. People who are not average.
Dying. Like no people dying talk here.
Hopefully not. Right, but when you've got people who are like outside of the average, however that might be, you've got sort of average people, you've got people who are on the edge of the average, and this is kind of what we look at with diversity. I have a sense that people who are out of the average are likely to be the first people to experience the effects of an organization that's just not treating them well. And so that can be a really interesting sort of way of looking at it, of saying, well, if we improve how we treat people in general, and we look to make our organization a place that is fit for supporting diversity, then as a side effect of that, we're probably making it better for everyone.
Yeah, no, that's really great. I agree.
Yep.
I'm going to pause us for a minute and see, do we have any questions from the audience on kind of starting out on planning, an approach to planning, or anything really we talked about so far? I don't know how they would appear here.
I'm seeing several questions there we have from the audience. I think some of them we'll be covering in the later sections as well.
Great. Well, I'm just seeing them coming up on the screen right now as well. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just reading them as they come in as well. Sorry, I didn't realize they would come up here. You're right. We're going to cover a lot of this in later sections, but I think what's interesting is what we touched on the involving people side of things, and talking about how you consider ENPS and how you consider your team's inputs into your plans. Swiftly moves us into the section of talking about how you involve other people outside of technology department and other teams in general into this process. And Graeme, you mentioned this already, that this is not something that's happening in a silo. Can you talk us quickly through how you're thinking about involving those other teams across the business, and how you make sure that you're not bumping into those business considerations and other stakeholders' issues?
Yeah. Sure. I think, my experience from Dazn around this is there were very clear targets in terms of engineers. That everyone was fixated about number of engineers and thinking, okay, if we have the maximum number of engineers, that'll make us the fastest we can possibly be. And I think what a lot of times they forget around, there's a lot of supporting actors that are needed to support the engineering function. So there's no point in having 300 engineers if there's one product person or one QA or one BA and a UX person. So I think, you as an engineering leader, when you're thinking about how you're going to build and structure these teams, you need to think about, okay, how are you going to feed the machine? What work do they need up front to be able for them to deliver? And so you almost need to start building out plans for other departments, especially if you're in hyper growth. And so, even if you're not, if you're being asked to onboard another team, well, you should be asking the question, well, who's going to be the product person? Who's going to be writing the stories? Who's going to be looking at this work. So I think it's your responsibility to do that. And I've seen it many times where, we've got engineers, they're in the seat and it's suddenly like, well, where's their work coming from? So it's vitally important. And I think you can't assume that other people are planning it. So once you've got your plan, I would certainly start thinking about, okay, what do you need to support this? And that can be, the roles can vary depending on the organization and how you're structured and how your delivery process is structured. So yeah, just be definitely mindful of that. I've in my last role, definitely been handing out my budget to support other departments because they didn't have budget for X number of people. So, there's no point in me having the budget sat there or hiring engineers if they can't deliver. So I've always sacrificed my budget to make sure that we have good ratios. And I think as well, you sometimes assume what a good ratio is, and that always changes. Once you start to grow and you get more people, you suddenly find other bottlenecks or you need more people. So always review. I think anything you do in this space is just have a checkpoint, take stock of what's going on, how are the teams impacted, what's the speed of delivery, is there anything we need to change and rebalance.
Would you say that applies to the questions that we got really from Ferdinand and from Gregory as well? I'm kind of figuring out the right mix of people in the team. So Ferdinand is asking about a permanent versus contractor ratio, and Gregory is asking about mid-level senior devs.
Yeah, I think in terms of the contractor staff ratio, I mean, there's all sorts of things that come into play there. I think if you're in a hyper growth, having contractors doesn't matter so much, because if you need another skill set in, well, you can the next hire can be that skill set. But if you're reaching the top of or where you need to be in terms of headcount, how do you make sure you've got that flexibility in your organization to develop the latest, a new device comes out and it's some bespoke language, or if your budget's set, you don't want to be making people redundant, and that's where contractors come in. So I think generally, if you're for me personally, if you're at a decent size organization, having 20% contractor is a good thing, and I think it's good to cycle them as well and make sure that you're bringing in new talent. But yeah, if you are scaling up massively, I don't think it matters right away, but certainly as you get towards the end, you do need them. So that's a ratio that I've typically worked with. But again, it can depend. You may be just scaling up to deliver a certain project for 1 to 2 years, and it's going to taper down. Well, then make sure that your contractors, you want to use your contractors as that flex. You don't want to hire permanent people knowing that you're going to have to make redundancies. So it's totally dependent on the project or the organization. And in terms of, I guess, how do you determine the levels? I think that's one for individual teams to start looking at. Can they support juniors? How are they a mature team that can bring a graduate or apprentice or a junior in, or what is the situations? And I would encourage junior people into the organization, because you want some people to come in and learn and push through. But I would say, work with the individual teams around, what can you accommodate? How can you support this person? Is this a team that is capable of accepting juniors and going through the organization like that? I don't think there's a hard and fast rule around how many you should have. I think it's totally dependent on the component or the application that you're looking after.
One thing, actually, if I could jump in, I would say I agree with you, Graeme. I think I have found, though, that some teams tend to be, I want senior, that's it. I want, they're always wanting senior, and without, it depends again on the need. Sometimes there is genuine need, but we ran into the difficulties of having too many seniors in one team and starting to basically have challenges in growth within the team. So I found that introducing, maybe encouraging a little bit, taking a chance on some people with potential, entry level with a lot of potential, often pays off a lot and provide growth opportunities for the senior people on the team. And it's also more cost effective as well, sometimes when considering headcount. I don't know, you agree.
Yeah, totally. And I remember back in Sky, everyone was like that. Everyone wanted seniors, and we introduced a grad program, and no one wanted the grads. And then we distributed these grads, people were forced to take them, and then the next year every single team was saying, can I have grads? And we couldn't accommodate how many grads were being requested for. So I think yes, you're right, sometimes teams are just, I want seniors. But yeah, I totally see the value and benefit that juniors can bring, and you'd have grads that were outperforming the seniors, and it kind of gave them a bit of a kick because they come in with lots of enthusiasm and they want to work hard and they want to learn, and it pushes the seniors as well. It ups their game. So I certainly do believe that you should have a good mix. I would always push for graduates and juniors.
Yeah, we in HubSpot we tend to have 2-to-1 ratio, I'd say, between junior to senior, something like that. Maybe one senior in a team, if I want to be specific.
Mm-hmm.
Nice, and I think that nicely overlaps with a question from Dan on the decisions on hiring being made often by people who don't maybe understand how engineering works, right? So you have stakeholders asking for seniors or stakeholders asking for a specific set of skills in your team without really understanding what that would do to that team and what would that mean for you as a manager. Do you have any tips? Like, we talked a lot about that approach to showing the value of bringing other people in. Do you have any other tips for how a manager in this situation can cope?
So I want to say I've been in that position a lot in my previous role in Activision Publishing. For sure, that was definitely a big part of my mental effort spent every year trying to convince, make a case for the headcount requirements. I would say here is identifying the decision makers here, and that can actually differ between organizations, but definitely you want to have finance on your side there. But sometimes the decision makers, like there could be other people that are playing a decision making role there. Usually groups that are bringing in revenue, like let's say you're doing R&D or your platform or infrastructure services for another group that is delivering the product, and sometimes they could be involved in the decision making for your budget. What you want here is that you want to be bringing them on board early, being transparent, and tying your asks with results. And they're going to want to see the return on the investment. And that's not always easy or possible. The thing that I found as well is that they would look at you with a big doubt if you don't identify what assumptions are you making in your planning and what are the risks that could happen, what could go wrong for this to not deliver on the intended return. And if you appear to be overly optimistic, they're going to be dismissing your plan as something overly optimistic and is not really going to be delivering what it promises. Now, there's going to be cases where, as well, like things like disaster recovery, infrastructure spend, those are things that are harder to tie into a specific value. Like take a disaster recovery. If you want to come with a disaster recovery plan, you want to take into consideration like what is the pros of this versus a very solid insurance policy. Perhaps that could cover most of the risk there. I guess they want to know that you've done your due diligence. The other thing that I found really useful is to offer cuts elsewhere. So say, you want to invest in an area and saying, look, this is going to introduce this saving, or say, we're going to make cuts. I actually believe that we should reduce the investment in this area and put it in this area, and make a solid case for doing that, plus some additional headcount. That could go a lot better than saying, just give me additional openings and I'm not going to make savings elsewhere. Like, it's just showing that we've at least done your due diligence there can really help. Tying any cost to a revenue or a risk mitigation is also going to be important. So, everything needs to be tied to some value.
Yeah, I think I'd add in on this one, Dan, around, it sounds like if this is happening, there's a breakdown in maybe trust between. I've seen it a lot with product people. Product people come and say, I want to hire 3 more people. It's like, okay, well, you haven't told me what the roadmap is, what your requirements are. And so to me, that sometimes comes from a lack of trust or relationship between the team and the product person. So I'd certainly look at improving that. And I think as well, it comes down to kind of roles and responsibilities as well. And I see this in organizations where there's not clear roles and responsibilities between teams. And we all, for organizations to work, everyone needs to trust that everyone is doing their role to the best of their ability. And I think, hiring engineers and how big the team is and what the structure is, that should be the engineering manager. That's engineering to be responsible for that. So I would make that clear to whoever's coming and making those demands. And I would start to build that relationship and trust. Maybe there isn't a clear, I don't know, a clear roadmap about what the team are doing, or there's clear requirements. I think you need to structure the conversations along these lines to build up that trust, build up that rapport, and make sure that, and just be straight and say, well, no, that isn't, that's my decision. Tell me what is this person going to deliver? What do you need to be delivered? And I'll come back with a plan, because it might be one senior, it may be two juniors, it may be actually this is best for a buy versus a build, or and that's decisions that engineering need to make.
Love that. We have another question from Dan, which is also really interesting, is on tips on convincing the board, or I guess budget owners, stakeholders, that PMs and BAs are actually needed to deliver value. So those kind of roles we spoke about that are not purely engineering roles, but kind of sitting outside of technology, but really needed for technology to be productive. Steve, you've been awfully quiet. Do you have any tips and tricks on dealing with that side of things?
Yeah. So my basic unit of scaling an organization and working an organization is the team. And the reason for that is that you can have this group of 7 or so people who have a very high bandwidth communication and higher degrees of trust and higher degrees of understanding what's going on with the work that team's doing. And the cool thing about teams is they don't have to be 100% software engineers who know how to program really well. Quite often, depending on what you're doing, you want different people on the team. Sometimes you want designers on the team. Sometimes you want dedicated testers on a team. Sometimes you want people who have these skills in a complex business domain of analyzing that business domain. And the other cool thing that can happen on teams is people can teach other people aspects of their work, not maybe the complete skill, but they can introduce people to aspects of it. People can collaborate and learn how to kind of gel their areas of expertise together. So, coming to the question then, it's like, I'm not sure I think something is wrong if a board or a senior group of people is being particularly concerned about the number of PMs, BAs, software developers, testers, and let's expand it to other roles. That instead, it's more about how are these teams able to function? Are they able to do the thing that they ought to be doing? Are they able to understand the problem to be solved and develop the product in the direction that it needs to be developed to solve that problem? Are they able to do so while not having people leave all the time or having other kind of toxicity problems of doing that? If that's the case, then that's great. So it's almost like there's probably some ways of convincing a board about this, but the thing I'd look to convince the board about is that they should look at different things, be concerned about some different things than that. So sorry, that's probably not a hugely satisfying answer to someone who's got that problem right now, but it's like, yeah, sorry.
I think for me, I think for me that's around, are the board fully cognizant of what the delivery lifecycle looks like? There's lots of roles that come into play when delivering software, and BAs and PMs can do some of these roles, but if you can articulate, look, we need to do this, we need to do X and Y, but at the minute you've got engineers doing this, and engineers aren't the best place, and now it's taking up 30% of their time to do PM activities and BA activities. So actually, they're not doing what we pay them to do, they're doing these other activities. And if you can start to explain that to people, they start to understand, oh, okay, right, I need that role. And sometimes you don't need these roles, and the engineers can pick it up. But if it's becoming cumbersome and actually they're spending more and more of their time doing this, okay, now's the time that you actually need a PM. And I think you just need to articulate that to people that are asking these questions, to make sure they fully understand what's involved in the software delivery lifecycle, because it isn't, I said this earlier, some companies are just fixated on engineers, people that can program, and forget that there's all these other people around that make this work. It's not just engineers. Yes, of course they could do it, but they're being dragged away from what we're paying them for. So yeah, that's how I would approach that.
Sounds great. All right, I'm really conscious that I still want to talk about executing against those budgets. I feel like we talked a lot about covering stakeholders, covering the board, engaging, PMs and other people in this process. But I'm really keen to talk about, okay, we created the budget, we have a team set up, we have the right mix of contractors and firms. We feel good about our seniors to mid-level and the juniors ratio, and the board is behind us and they're supporting us. And then, January 1st or April 1st comes in and we're starting executing against the budget. And of course, there's a lot of things you have to now consider in terms of executing and bringing those people on board. And Graeme, you already mentioned at the beginning that you really have to think about onboarding and, hiring plans and flighting all of this activity throughout the year. Can you talk us a bit about your approach to that? Any tips or tools that you want to share with people listening?
Oh. This was, I seem to remember lots of PowerPoint presentations and going on a bit of a roadshow. So I think you have to make sure that you're clear about what you're trying to achieve and making sure that you go round and let everyone know this is where we are, this is what we're doing, and your plans will change. I think that's a really important thing to learn, that you may think you know what you need, and as soon as you get one or two people in, you start to realize, oh, actually that's not quite working, and you start to form teams around individuals instead of roles. You may hire someone who's excellent in something, so you suddenly start to build a team around that, and your dynamic change and the teams change, and how you thought about it changes. So I think you have to be really cognizant that these things do change, and they change quite frequently. And the market changes things as well. If suddenly, it's really tough to get, Java developers, then you may decide to switch languages or something as well. So I think so much comes into play that you just need to make sure that you've got a really strong governance around keeping track of this, keeping people informed, reviewing, going back, changing. Fine if it's, if you're just hiring, a couple of people, it probably won't change. But if you're starting to hire 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, whatever you started with will not be the end. And so just bear that in mind, and make sure that everyone knows that as well, that this isn't a concrete plan. This will be revised, this will be changed, but as soon as we change it, you will be informed, you will know. And so, yeah, that's how I would approach that.
Yeah, I love that. Whatever you start with is definitely not what you're going to add. I don't think I ever ended a year with the same kind of team that I planned to have at the beginning of the year. So I hear you on that. Everyday change.
One tip I do have, one problem you can get into, I think some people start to look at budget for the year, and when hiring slows down towards the end of the year, they've got more budget, so they think, oh, I can hire more people, or I can get more expensive people, without realizing that, okay, the next year you're going to have a bit of a problem, because now we've got more people that we planned. So you need to keep an eye on the next 2-3 years about what you're doing. Don't just spend your budget whenever you're going through. I think whenever you're going through growth, I think whatever your budget is in the first year, you'll never end up spending it, because something will happen. There'll be problems in hiring, and don't go and spend that on more hires, because you're going to have a problem next year, and finance won't be happy. So watch out for that.
There's a similar dynamic when you're looking at OPEX versus CAPEX. So if you've got a new product, and so it makes sense to capitalize that. So you're saying let's spread the cost of that in the accounts over several years. And then that team, or the group building that, moves into having a more mature product where there's a lot less new work being done and a lot more sort of maintenance kind of work or small changes. The amount you can capitalize goes down. And this can come as a surprise, because it's almost as if some of the development cost was free or appearing in the yearly accounts free in the first year. It's not, of course, but it looks that way in the accounts. And then a few years later, you find that, well, actually, we have to consider operationally the cost of these developers. So it's another sort of dynamic that can change sort of unexpectedly over time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it can definitely make finance team unhappy as well. Yeah. And thinking about like what changes and what impacts your teams throughout the year. Obviously, again, 2020 is a very special year compared to previous years. I think it's probably the most true this year that whatever you started on in January is long gone and, throughout the window. I'm sure you all have stories or experiences from this year. that taught you something about adjusting for change and helping your teams through it. Maybe Nadia, starting with you, like what are your kind of key lessons and thoughts about 2020 and how it impacted your thinking around your team setup and plans going forward?
I mean, there's no need to say it's been a rough year on everybody. But a key lesson here that to remember, always remember that there's nothing certain. You need to really always be preparing for roadblocks along the way, and don't get too attached to your plan, and being ready to shift and redirect the ship if circumstances arise. Unfortunately, many businesses did not survive the crisis, and partially for some of them, because they did not adapt quickly, perhaps. For many, it was just unavoidable. And I think there is some theme in some of the business that survives against the odds, where that they reinvented themselves to survive here. HubSpot here in HubSpot really came out of the crisis stronger, and even though our main customers were highly impacted, because our business is on delivering services to mid to small size businesses. So obviously anything that impact businesses would impact our business, but actually we came out of it stronger and did a lot better during the crisis, because we dealt with it with empathy. We focused on their success and survival, and offering incentives, price cuts, anything, and focusing in particular on the fact that they need to now run their operations remotely. They need to shift their business models, and how can they go about doing that in this environment. And this really, like, our customers' eNPS came through the roof. Everyone is a lot happier. The customer base, it grew as well. Of course, doing that meant that shifting some of the planning, things that were highly important became not important. Things that were not that important became very important. New things came along. I want to also put something here, is that sometimes this also impacts the teams themselves. They might feel discouraged. They might feel like, okay, I had this perfect laid out plan and now it's all different. And you just need to say it's okay. That is absolutely okay. And just dealing with it with empathy. And again, it's just about not getting attached to your perfectly laid out plan, because it almost never really happens the same way you expected it to.
Yeah, totally agree. Graeme, did you have to make any big changes throughout 2020?
I think one of the big things that we did have to change was around, okay, how do we recruit? How do you do that remotely when you don't physically see them or they don't come into the office? How can you show them what a great workplace environment you've got? And onboarding, how do you onboard remotely? Like we had great plans. We were very good at this, but how do you adapt them for remote working? And it also, junior people, they obviously need more support. And I don't think anyone's really cracked this yet, but junior engineers come in, they just when they're sat with the teams in and around them, they just pick up things. But how do you translate that to remote working? So I think there's still work to be done there, but definitely in terms of just hiring, keeping teams motivated, was all stuff that we really needed to change. And so I think we did put a bit of a pause on recruitment while we experimented with some onboarding, because we wanted to make sure that people were having a good experience. And so, yeah, that was stuff that definitely changed for us in this space.
Mm-hmm. Steve, any lessons from 2020 that you want to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I started something new in 2020, so I was naturally finishing something and then starting something new. So I didn't really have the experience of adapting something. But it did cause me to go back and look at some research I saw in 2019 around what are the factors that influence engagement in people, in organizations, when things are in times of change and then in times of stability. So I just want to mention this. In times of stability, the key thing that impacts engagement is understanding the career path, according to this survey. In times of change, it's being involved in decision-making. And so that gets me thinking the way I want to engage as a leader in times of change, which now, this is a time of uncertainty, which I think is pretty much the same thing as change, is to see how much more we can involve people in their decision-making, so people feel they've got at least some connection to change that can be controlled as well as change that can't.
Yeah, I love that. Look, I think we covered a lot of broad subjects, and we could go so much deeper. Like just looking at questions coming in, you can ask very detailed and specific questions about budgeting for the specific line in your plan, or dealing with that specific problem with seniority or the right mix of people on the team. I think what we're really uncovering here, that this is a very broad and complicated subject that doesn't have simple answers, unfortunately. But what we're also seeing is that whether you're growing your team completely from zero to something a bit bigger, or from mid-sized team to something massive, or maybe you have to downsize team and maybe you're thinking about managing towards cost. Everybody's dealing with the same problems. There are tools, there are methods and tricks you can learn and adapt as you go through this. I think the other important thing is that there's a community of engineering managers and leaders out there you can reach out and get help and questions from. And I think that's something I've learned from this experience as well, chatting to all of you. We all have different experiences. We all can learn from each other. And there's no easy answer. There's no easy, silver bullet to solve it. And we're definitely running out of time. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you for this amazing panel, guys. This was a great conversation. And I'm looking forward chatting a bit more on Slack.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, everyone.